Ma'am, you need to step aside. This flight is for VIPs only. The woman smiled, unfazed. The flight attendant scoffed. The pilot chuckled. No one had any idea they were humiliating the owner of the plane. What happened next left the entire crew in complete shock. The airport buzzed with the usual chaos of early morning departures. The sound of rolling luggage, overhead announcements, and the shuffle of impatient passengers filled the air. Among them, one woman moved through the crowd with an air of quiet authority. Her name was Andrea, but to most people she was just another well-dressed passenger. At first glance, Andrea didn't stand out. She wore a simple tailored black suit, a white blouse, and her hair was neatly tied back in a low bun. Nothing about her screamed VIP or CEO, and yet that's exactly who she was. A brilliant, successful black businesswoman and the CEO of a thriving tech startup that was taking the industry by storm. She had built her empire from the ground up, fighting against every stereotype, every obstacle that society had thrown her way. But none of that mattered here. In the world of first-class flights and private jets, she was just another person in a sea of travelers. As Andrea approached the check-in desk for her private jet, her steps were measured, calm, and confident. She knew the rules of the game. She had done this 1,000 times before. The same sleek black suitcase rolled beside her, and her phone vibrated every few seconds with updates about her company's latest business deal. She was accustomed to this kind of busy day, but she was not prepared for the look she received when she reached the check-in counter. The agent, a young woman with perfectly styled hair and a uniform that seemed a little too tight for comfort, didn't look up at Andrea immediately. She continued typing something on her computer screen, eyes scanning the ticket in front of her. Andrea smiled politely and placed her ticket on the counter. "Good morning," Andrea said smoothly, her voice soft but firm. The agent barely acknowledged her. With a swift motion, she picked up the ticket and glanced at it, then at Andrea, before handing it back with a dismissive gesture. "Sorry, ma'am. This flight isn't for you." "Please step aside," the agent said, her tone cold, almost condescending. Andrea blinked in surprise, unsure if she had heard correctly. She had traveled on this same jet countless times. Never once had anyone questioned her or her place on the flight. "I believe there's been some mistake," Andrea said, keeping her voice steady. "I'm booked for this flight. I'm the CEO of the company that owns this jet. I believe you're not looking at the correct information." The agent didn't respond. Instead, she glanced briefly at Andrea's attire and her perfectly composed demeanor. Then, with a dismissive sigh, she pressed a button on her phone and spoke into the intercom. "I need some assistance here," she muttered, her voice laced with annoyance. Within moments, another staff member appeared, a tall man in a dark suit who looked far too busy to be bothered with this minor inconvenience. He took a quick look at Andrea, then glanced at the agent behind the counter. "Is there a problem?" he asked, his tone flat. The agent didn't hesitate. "This woman doesn't belong on this flight. She's clearly in the wrong line, and she's causing a scene." Andrea's brow furrowed. She had worked too hard to get where she was, and no one was going to make her feel small, especially not in her own airport. "I don't think you understand who I am," Andrea said, the calmness of her voice now slipping into something colder, more commanding. "This is my jet. I've already checked in. You can double-check the records if you'd like." But before the man could respond, a voice from the back of the terminal spoke up, cutting through the tension like a knife. "Excuse me, is there a problem here?" It was the pilot. He was tall, with a confident, almost arrogant demeanor. His uniform was crisp, his hat perfectly placed. He glanced at Andrea and then turned his gaze back to the staff, his eyes narrowing slightly. "She's booked for this flight, right?" he asked, though his tone made it clear he didn't expect an answer. He was already making up his mind. The tension in the air was palpable as Andrea stood silently, her posture unshaken, despite the growing hostility around her. The pilot's cold gaze swept over her once more, lingering a moment longer than necessary, before he spoke again. His tone was casual, almost dismissive, as if he were speaking to someone who didn't belong in this world. "She's not supposed to be here," he muttered to the airport staff. "This is a high-priority flight. We don't have time to cater to every passenger that doesn't meet our standards." Andrea clenched her jaw, but remained calm. Her years of navigating a world that often underestimated her had taught her the power of silence. Still, the sting of his words cut deeper than she had expected. She had faced discrimination before, but this time it felt different. This time, it wasn't just about the color of her skin or the fact that she was a woman. It was about the fact that, in their eyes, she wasn't worthy of the privilege of first-class, private jet travel. The man in the dark suit, who had been so quick to dismiss her, now exchanged a glance with the pilot, as if they were both in agreement. They looked at each other as if Andrea were a problem to be solved, something to be brushed aside, forgotten. "I don't think this is going to work out," the staff member said to Andrea, the edge of his voice sharp now. "You should just leave. We can't have you causing a disruption before the flight even begins." The words felt like a slap in the face. Andrea's chest tightened, but she refused to let the tears well up. She had spent so many years proving herself to people who never thought she would make it, people who didn't believe she deserved the success she had earned. She wasn't about to let this man or anyone else make her feel small. "I am not going anywhere," Andrea said, her voice unwavering. The crowd around them seemed to freeze. People glanced nervously, some shaking their heads, others pretending not to notice the escalating scene. No one dared to speak up. No one stood in solidarity with her. The agent, seeing Andrea's resolve, tried again, this time with a voice that dripped with false politeness. "Look, you've clearly misunderstood," she said, leaning over the counter. "This jet is reserved for corporate executives, people who have the connections and resources to be on this flight, people who matter. You're just a civilian, and I'm afraid your ticket doesn't hold up here." Andrea's hand instinctively reached for her phone, but she didn't make a call just yet. Instead, she let the silence grow, savoring the moment of tension. The staff members exchanged confused glances, unsure of what to make of her stillness. They expected anger, perhaps a loud protest. They did not expect this calm, this poise. Just as the air seemed to grow thick with anticipation, the pilot broke the silence with a sharp laugh. "Honestly, lady," he sneered, "I don't think you understand how things work around here. Maybe if you spent less time pretending to be something you're not, you'd realize this isn't a place for people like you." The crowd shifted uncomfortably, but Andrea remained unmoved. His words stung, but she wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of seeing her upset. She had faced worse in boardrooms, in business meetings where men like him tried to belittle her and undermine her authority. She had dealt with people who underestimated her every step of the way, and she had proven them all wrong. She would do the same now. With a slow, deliberate motion, Andrea reached for her phone, typing out a quick message. She didn't need to explain who she was or why she belonged on this flight. Those who mattered already knew. Those who didn't would soon find out. As she sent the message, she looked up at the pilot, her eyes narrowing with a quiet intensity. "I'm the one who signs your paycheck," she said simply, "and I've been more than patient. But now, I suggest you start treating me with the respect I deserve, or you won't be the one flying this jet today." The pilot's smug expression faltered for the briefest moment, but he quickly regained his composure. He scoffed and turned his attention back to the staff, clearly unwilling to accept the weight of her words. The agent, now visibly flustered, quickly reached for the phone on the counter. "I'll call the manager," she said, but the tremor in her voice betrayed her uncertainty. Andrea's heart raced, but her exterior remained as steady as ever. The pilot and the agent were about to learn that the woman they'd tried to humiliate was far more than they could ever have imagined. She wasn't just a CEO. She was the woman who could shut down everything they thought they knew about power, about privilege, and about what it truly meant to deserve a seat at the table. Her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from her assistant. A simple line that changed everything. "The jet's management just confirmed. Your flight is ready for departure. The crew has been notified." The pilot's face drained of color, and the staff's attitude began to shift, but Andrea didn't need to say a word. The truth was already on its way, and with it, everything they thought they knew about her was about to come crashing down. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Andrea stood still, her gaze unwavering, as the staff fumbled with their phones and whispered urgently between themselves. The pilot, still trying to keep up the facade of control, glanced around nervously, but there was no denying the growing discomfort in the air. The people around them, those who had been too afraid to speak out, began to shift uneasily. They had seen enough. This wasn't just about a flight. It was something more. The agent who had first dismissed Andrea still stood with her arms crossed, her stance more defensive now, as if she had begun to regret her earlier dismissal. She could feel the weight of Andrea's silence, and it gnawed at her. There was something about this woman, something about the way she stood there, so composed in the face of such disrespect, that made her uneasy. A few feet away, a couple of well-dressed businessmen in the waiting area whispered to each other, casting furtive glances at Andrea. They exchanged knowing looks, the kind of look that said, "I know what's going on, but I'm not going to get involved." Yet, despite their desire to remain neutral, their eyes betrayed them, darting from Andrea to the staff and back again. Andrea took another step forward, unbothered by the murmurs and the shifting atmosphere around her. She knew the eyes of the crowd were upon her now, and she wasn't going to let their judgment move her. She was used to this, used to being underestimated, used to being the one others tried to silence. But today, things were different. She wasn't going to let this moment pass without making her presence known, without reminding these people that she had earned everything she had. She belonged here, and she wasn't going anywhere. "Is there a problem here, or should I get security?" The pilot's voice broke through the tension, his attempt at regaining control faltering as he looked nervously toward the back of the terminal. But Andrea wasn't fazed. She could see the cracks in his demeanor. She could feel his uncertainty, and she savored it. The woman who had once been told she didn't belong in this space, the woman who had been looked down upon for years, was now standing tall, unshaken in the face of their arrogance. "I think the real question," Andrea said slowly, her voice cutting through the tension with the quiet precision of a razor, "is whether you're willing to face the consequences of your actions today." The pilot scoffed, but his eyes flickered with a hint of fear. He had no idea who he was dealing with. None of them did. "I'm afraid you're not the one who decides what happens next," the agent shot back, her voice defensive, though it wavered slightly. "You're just a passenger, and if you continue causing a disturbance, I will have to call the police." But Andrea was already 2 steps ahead. As the agent fumbled with her phone, she reached into her purse and pulled out her own device, her fingers moving swiftly across the screen. She'd already sent the message. The response was almost immediate. Her assistant had confirmed it once more. The jet was ready, and the crew had been informed. With that, Andrea stood a little straighter, and a subtle smile tugged at the corners of her lips. The agent, still oblivious to what was unfolding, glanced at her phone and froze. Her hand went limp, and the words on the screen seemed to make her stomach drop. The pilot's face paled as he looked at Andrea, the realization starting to sink in. His earlier arrogance melted away, replaced by a growing sense of panic. His knees were trembling now, his usual confidence crumbling under the weight of the truth. "You should have checked your facts before deciding to treat me like this," Andrea said quietly, her voice dripping with controlled power. "I'm not just any passenger. I'm the one who pays your salary." The words hung in the air, each syllable falling like a hammer. The pilot's mouth opened, but no words came out. He wanted to argue, to justify himself, but there was nothing he could say. He had crossed a line that he could never uncross. As Andrea waited for him to say something, anything, her eyes flicked to the agent, who was still staring at her phone, in shock. A few seconds passed before the agent finally looked up, but it was too late. The damage had been done. The people in the waiting area, who had been watching this entire scene unfold, began to shift uncomfortably. Some looked away, pretending not to notice the growing tension, but others, those who had been silent observers until now, began to murmur among themselves. It was as if a switch had been flipped. They could no longer ignore what was happening. Andrea didn't care about their reactions. She had never lived her life for the approval of others, and she certainly wasn't about to start now. But as the pilot stood there, unsure of how to move forward, Andrea could see the ripple effect spreading. She had become the catalyst, the spark that lit a fire, and in that moment, it was clear to everyone in the room that things were about to change. She looked at the agent, her eyes hardening with finality. "I'm getting on that flight," Andrea said, her tone final. "And you," she pointed a finger toward the pilot, "you're going to apologize. Right now." The air seemed to freeze, the crowd waiting with bated breath to see what would happen next. The pilot opened his mouth to protest, but his words were lost in his throat. He knew, deep down, that the battle was already over. He had lost. The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Andrea's command was calm, but there was an undeniable edge to it, one that sent a chill through the room. The people who had been watching, some with discomfort, others with curiosity, now held their breath. It was as if time itself had paused, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone. The pilot's face drained of color. He had been so sure of his authority, so confident in his position, that he hadn't considered what might happen if his assumptions were wrong. But now, standing before Andrea, who, to his horror, was clearly no ordinary passenger, he could see the cracks in his composure. His mouth moved, but no sound came out. He was paralyzed, caught between his pride and the undeniable reality unfolding in front of him. Andrea stood tall, unwavering. She knew the power of silence, the kind that unsettled people, made them squirm, made them face the uncomfortable truth. She wasn't asking for an apology. She was demanding one, and she wasn't going to back down. The agent who had originally tried to dismiss her looked around helplessly, unsure of what to do. Her fingers hovered above her phone, but she made no move to call security or escalate the situation. She could feel the tide turning. The smugness she had once carried was now replaced by a growing sense of dread. She too could see the truth. Andrea's phone buzzed again, and she glanced down, her eyes narrowing as she read the new message. Her assistant had sent over the final confirmation. The jet was cleared for departure. The crew was already en route to the tarmac, awaiting the CEO. The message was simple, it was direct, and it was enough to seal the fate of the pilot, the agent, and anyone else who thought they could get away with humiliating her. The pilot took a shaky step forward, his hands trembling slightly as he wiped his brow. He couldn't look Andrea in the eye. He knew that, in this moment, everything had changed. His arrogant sneer, once so sure, had turned into a look of pure disbelief. This woman he had so carelessly dismissed, was now standing there with a quiet power that he couldn't comprehend. I didn't realize. His words came out in fragments, each one weaker than the last. It was clear now. He had no idea who Andrea was, and now that he did, he wasn't sure how to undo the damage he'd caused. Andrea's voice was low, but it carried with it the weight of authority. You didn't realize? That's the problem, isn't it? People like you don't take the time to realize who's standing in front of you. You think you can just dismiss anyone who doesn't fit your narrow view of the world. The pilot flinched, as if struck by the force of her words. The crowd, who had been silently observing the scene, began to murmur. Some had shifted uncomfortably, while others had taken a step closer, drawn by the intensity of the moment. The room felt smaller now, as if the walls themselves were closing in on the people who had once thought they held all the power. Andrea stepped forward, her eyes locking with the pilot's. "Apologize," she said, her voice sharp, unforgiving. "Now." The pilot opened his mouth, but no words came. He had been too proud, too quick to judge, and now he was faced with the consequences of his actions. For a moment, he seemed to collapse inward, his shoulders slumping as if the weight of the truth had finally crushed him. Without waiting for him to speak, Andrea turned to the agent. "You," she said, her gaze cutting through the woman like a blade. "You've had your part in this too. You've watched this happen, and you've done nothing. You should be ashamed of yourself." The agent's face turned crimson, and she tried to avert her eyes, but Andrea's gaze held her in place. The silence stretched on, and the tension continued to build, each passing second feeling like an eternity. The pilot finally muttered a few words. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice barely a whisper, though the sincerity was missing. But Andrea wasn't finished. She didn't need to hear an apology for the sake of politeness. She wanted to see him understand. She wanted him to feel the weight of what he had done. "No," she said, her voice firm. "You're not sorry because you've been humbled. You're sorry because you were wrong. And until you learn the difference, this apology means nothing." She turned to the staff, and with a look that left no room for negotiation, Andrea spoke one final time. "This flight is mine, and you all will remember this moment, every last one of you." As the words left her lips, the pilot and the agent were left standing there, frozen. The room around them, once filled with skepticism and judgment, now buzzed with a new energy. There was no denying what had just happened. The tables had turned. The woman they had underestimated had proven her worth in a way they would never forget. And as Andrea turned to walk toward the gate, her head held high, she knew one thing for certain. This was just the beginning. The world was about to see her in a new light, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. The silence that followed Andrea's final words was deafening. The pilot and the agent remained rooted to the spot, stunned into inaction. The air seemed to thicken, suffocating them as the reality of what had just happened slowly set in. The crowd that had gathered, once silent witnesses, now exchanged glances, their collective discomfort palpable. It was clear. The power dynamics in the room had shifted irreparably. Andrea's steps were measured, unhurried, as she walked toward the gate. The sound of her heels clicking against the polished floor was the only noise that filled the tense void. She moved with purpose, her posture tall and commanding. But as she passed the staff, she didn't look back. She didn't need to. The agent, still holding her phone with shaking hands, looked at the pilot, who was now struggling to find his composure. He opened his mouth, but no words came. The apology he had muttered earlier hung in the air, hollow and unconvincing. He had been humiliated, exposed, and now there was nothing left to salvage. His reputation, carefully built on years of smug confidence, lay in ruins. As Andrea reached the gate, the manager, a tall, composed woman in a sleek uniform, appeared, her expression unreadable. She gave Andrea a quick, respectful nod, then turned to the staff. The message was clear. The situation had been handled. The pilot and the agent, on the other hand, were no longer part of the equation. Within minutes, the agent was called away by her superior, her face flushed with embarrassment. The pilot was informed in no uncertain terms that his conduct had been deemed unacceptable. The airline's management had already initiated an internal review. Both would face the consequences of their actions. As Andrea boarded her jet, she didn't feel the need to gloat. There was no smug smile, no gesture of triumph. She had won, not because she had humiliated them, but because she had refused to let them define her. She walked into the cabin, where the crew had been informed of the situation, and nodded with a simple, calm acknowledgement. They knew who she was. They had always known. And as the plane took off, leaving the terminal behind, Andrea couldn't help but feel a quiet satisfaction. Justice had been served, not just for herself, but for anyone who had ever been overlooked, underestimated, or dismissed. The world was hers to command, and no one would forget the lesson she had taught that day. As the jet soared through the clouds, Andrea gazed out of the window, the city below slowly fading into the distance. The sun was setting, casting a warm golden glow across the sky, but inside the cabin, it was her quiet reflection that filled the space. It wasn't the thrill of victory that gave her peace. It was the certainty that she had stood her ground when it mattered most. She had fought for respect, not with force, but with the power of knowing her worth. And that was the greatest lesson she could offer to anyone who had ever been doubted or dismissed. Never let someone else define your value. Own it. Stand in it. And when the world tries to make you small, remind them just how big you really are. As the plane settled into its course, Andrea closed her eyes for a moment, her mind already moving forward to the next challenge. She knew that there would be many more. But one thing was certain. No one would ever underestimate her again. If you've ever faced a moment where you were made to feel less than you are, Andrea's story might resonate with you. It's a reminder that true power doesn't come from how others see you, but from how you see yourself. So, don't let anyone dictate your worth. Stand tall, speak your truth, and let the world catch up. If you found this story inspiring, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more powerful stories that remind us all to never back down, no matter the odds.